Our picture of the past is always so oversimplified. The past is always going to be far more complex than we can possibly imagine because we have so little to go on to reconstruct it.
You haven't done a lot of podcasts, right?
I guess you could call it the first podcast that I've done. I always sort of jokingly call the pyramids a mountain of evidence. And in archaeology, a lot of times you're just dealing with scraps, you're dealing with tiny little mud seals, but the pyramids are different. The pyramids are mostly intact. A sketch of the top 3 layers of the Great Pyramid at that time. It's basically a technical diagram of a missing piece of a wonder of the ancient world. And so I sort of see the pyramid as more like a temple or a church or a cathedral than just, a place to stash a body. Every king's pyramid in the Old Kingdom has pieces of a stone sarcophagus in it, except the 3 Snefru pyramids. But just because no pyramid after the bent looks like the bent, that doesn't mean that it was a mistake in its time. The bend in the pyramid is not structural, it's purely aesthetic. I always say that my best way of studying the pyramids is compare them to each other, and there's not really anything you can really compare the step pyramid to. I think that the pharaohs building the pyramids, I think they saw it as they got the most benefit while they were alive rather than for the afterlife.
Brother, it is good to have you here today, man.
Thank you. It's fun to be here.
For sure. Yeah, history for Granite.
That's right.
Doug, and it's been great to get to know you over the last day. How would you describe your kind of view of the ancient world? Where do you stand on the spectrum?
So, that's a good question. I guess you would say that I'm a person, I do deeply respect the tradition of archaeology and Egyptology, so I'm not too far out there in terms of, I guess what you'd say the conventional view of ancient history. But at the same time, I feel deeply, particularly with respect to a particular portion of history involving the pyramids, the Old Kingdom pyramids of Egypt, that there was just a lot left on the table. I mean, I always sort of jokingly call the pyramids a mountain of evidence, right? And in archaeology, a lot of times you're just dealing with scraps, you're dealing with tiny little mud seals or just the foundation of structures that were destroyed long ago. But the pyramids are different. The pyramids are mostly intact. And there's just a lot of clues, a lot of interesting things about them that inform us about the ancient past that I don't think have yet to be investigated formally by, the academic institutions that do that. And so, at some point, there's not like an obvious reason, I think, to spend a lot of time doing this other than that you love it, right? And so at a certain point in my life, I was like, you know what? I need a fun project. I'm just gonna learn about this stuff for me, and then eventually I'd learned enough to where I thought it was good that I share it with the world.
Yeah, and when was that? When did you have that realization? When did you start this journey?
So I would say that the journey started to amp up for me around the time the Scanned Pyramids mission was really getting underway. So that's like 2015 to 2017. I was, of course, the announcement of the internal cavities inside the Great Pyramid were a great surprise to everyone. And, I was like, wow, there's still a lot about pyramids that we just don't know. And at the same time, there was an independent researcher by the name of Keith Hamilton who started publishing, he calls them layman's guides to pyramids independently. And when I would read those, I was like, they just blew me away because I could not believe how much there was left to learn, not just about the Great Pyramid, but all the pyramids. And he did such a great job of, explaining the interesting architectural features and what was mysterious about them and what hadn't been investigated and evidence that had been lost, that I was like, oh, this is really something that I can sink my teeth into. And so that's really sort of what got me going on my journey. And, after I had done, I would say a year or two of pretty serious research, I didn't really know necessarily what to do with it. I was like, should I try to write a book or, maybe publish some papers or something? But I was already a fairly accomplished video maker, and I thought, why am I making this hard on myself? I should just go straight to YouTube and publish my ideas like directly,
Right.
and that's that'll just make it a little easier on myself than trying to write a book.
Yep, for sure. Yeah. So your YouTube channel is what? Tell us about your social media presence, I guess.
So I'm really just on YouTube, right? The channel's called History for Granite. And, I'm going on my 5th year now of having the channel. And, I don't release videos too often because they're very in depth. I would say it's about once a month, ideally. And I also do a weekly live stream for my channel members working on a long-term project, which is sort of me just sort of talking off the cuff about things that are interesting to me. But primarily it's just those, my videos are usually 20 to 30 minute long, sort of deep dives into various aspects of Old Kingdom pyramids.
Right. And they're very highly respected, and they're talked about by people in both, the alternative ancient history community and the mainstream alternative, and respected by both, which is really cool. I mean, your average video on your YouTube channel might be getting what in terms of views?
Probably average between 500,000 and 1 million, I would say.
Yeah.
Pretty good numbers.
Yeah, it's solid. So, I mean, your voice is out there and it's being heard, and you haven't done a lot of podcasts, right?
No, this is actually really, I think I guess you could call it the first podcast that I've done. I'm kind of old school in the sense that, I feel like the pyramids are the story, not me, right? And so as a faceless channel, I think that helps keep the focus on what I think is most interesting, which is the evidence. But at the same time, it'll be nice to sort of, dip my toe into the waters of, being a more public face of the channel, and, people can see me speak off the cuff, and I'll probably make a few more mistakes because of that, but that's okay. That's just part of the game. Everything can't be totally controlled and scripted all the time. So this is going to be fun.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, hopefully this is the start of more, and we get you on Joe Rogan in 2026. So yeah, that's cool. What was it about Limitless that made this your first choice to get out there and talk about your knowledge of the pyramids?
Well, that's a great question, Matt. And it really is a credit to you, because a lot of podcasts, they don't, pyramids might just be sort of the flavor of the week, and the host probably doesn't really know that much about ancient Egypt, or isn't, they might have sort of a fleeting superficial interest, but, they're talking about other stuff most of the time. And so that's one reason, is that clearly you have a genuine passion for the subject.
Thank you.
And also, I really do profoundly appreciate your involvement in the latest missions in Egypt in terms of funding and supporting and facilitating those projects. In terms of exploring the big void in particular, because I think a lot of people believe that, these things will just happen, right? But no, someone actually has to make them happen. No matter how interesting it might be, someone still has to do the work and write the checks and, organize it. And so I deeply appreciate you stepping forward and participating in that way. That's a huge deal.
It's kind of you to say. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm honored and grateful to do it. And it's something that we need to have a sense of urgency on and figure out. And there's genuine interest out there. I know I'm extremely passionate about it. I know my audience is, and I know the world is extremely passionate about finding out what's in there. So no, that's a very thoughtful reply. I really appreciate that. So today we are going to make the best podcast on the pyramids. It's
pyramids only.
Pyramids only. We're going to really focus on the pyramids today and just make this all about that, and just kind of get your perspective on each one, and kind of the anomalies, the things that make them interesting, the really big mysteries about them, and just the boring stuff. Like, okay, no, this might be an air shaft, guys. Like we're talking about last night.
That's exciting. Air shafts are exciting.
Yeah, totally. So I can't wait to dive in and get into that with you. And which pyramid do you think would be the best one to begin?
So I think we should start. I think we should start with the Great Pyramid. That is almost everyone's favorite. And there's a particular. I think there's a fun thing to start about the Great Pyramid, which is, it's not actually that mysterious, but it's extremely interesting and extremely revealing about what the ancient Egyptians were up to, and that is the summit. Now, most people will have probably seen great pictures of the Great Pyramid, and you notice that the summit is flat, right? The top, unlike pretty much every other pyramid, the top has just been completely leveled. And one of my approaches to studying the pyramids is to really dive into the historical testimonies of people that had visited them, ever since probably about the late 1400s, early 1500s, when the Europeans really started visiting Egypt more and documenting what they saw, their experiences. And the pyramids, of course, was on everyone's list to do. And so there's actually a lot of in-depth testimonies about what the pyramids were like going back to that time. And so an interesting mystery for me is like, well, why did the top of the Great Pyramid go missing, right? Like, you look at the other pyramids. I mean, yeah, you don't see the capstone anymore, but they're still pretty well intact up there. And so I was looking through the sort of historical accounts of people visiting, and by the time the Europeans had arrived, all the casing stones were gone. The casing stones were removed from the Great Pyramid probably in the 1300s, except for a few that were buried in sand at the bottom, right? So all the Europeans are coming, and they're seeing it more or less as we see it now, the sort of stepped inner core.
And I'm sorry, the Torah limestone casing stones on the top were taken off and just reused within Cairo and around the area?
I mean, it's not known exactly where those casing stones ended up. Presumably, Cairo had a major earthquake in the early 1300s, and so it was probably seen as like an ideal nearby location to get a bunch of stone to rebuild the city.
Sure.
And so that was probably a primary factor as to why it happened then. There's a lot of people who are like, oh, well, the earthquake probably shook the casing stones off.
No.
I don't think that's probably what happened. No. It might have loosened them a little bit. It might have made it a little bit easier to pull them off, but they were definitely pulled off to build structures in the city or elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And so when the Europeans various people are climbing the Great Pyramid, and everyone's really interested in its size, right? Everyone's like, well, how tall is it? And what everyone does to sort of measure it at this time is they count the steps all the way to the top, because that's how you climb it. It's very natural. It's a very easy way of keeping account of things. But in this time, everyone's giving kind of wildly different step counts, right? The numbers are not nearly as consistent as you would think that it would be. They would be, right? Okay. Some people are clearly kind of estimating or whatever, but and so the question is like, well, why is this, right? And I think a lot of people assume that, everyone, people at the top would just occasionally throw a block down, and it would just sort of slowly lose the top by attrition. That's the kind of assumption you might make if you just looked at the data sort of at a glance. But actually, that's not what was happening. The problem was that even though it looks like it'd be easy to count the steps going up, sometimes the inner blocks double up, right? The outer backing stones are different than the stones right behind them. And so sometimes there would be like two courses where blocks had fallen off more, and people wouldn't notice that as they were climbing. And also, that'll vary depending upon which way you go up the pyramid. Which face are you going up? Are you going up a corner? And so everyone is sort of they're counting reasonably accurately, but you're still getting different numbers. And so what I realized was, okay, this is the worst way to try to keep track of what's happening to the Great Pyramid. And so, but a few people are enterprising enough to actually measure the top, measure the summit. And you can see that all the measurements prior to the late 1700s are about the same, right? Even though people are using different units, and people don't, they're just using their own feet or their own arms or whatever, because they didn't bring, necessarily measuring instruments with them. But they're still all within about a meter, similar. And it's a much smaller space. It's a much smaller dimension than it is now. Now I think it's about 10 meters or 30 feet at the top on each side square. And back then it was about half that. And so eventually, as I'm sort of keeping track of, the size of the summit and trying to narrow down what was going on, it became apparent that the vast majority of the summit came off in a very short period of time. It wasn't like, we just go a little bit, every century or whatever. It was pretty much all intact as it was after the casing stones were stripped off until getting close to the 1800s. And there was one particular explorer named Nathaniel Davison who visited in 1763 to 1765, and he was much more diligent than the people that came before him, and he actually measured each step on the way up. And so this kind of gave like a better reference to figure out, okay, what exactly did the pyramid look like in 1765 compared to today? And in comparing his measurements to Flinders Petrie, you could see that his measurements were very good. Like he was taking his time to do this. And in his time, there were 206 courses, and right now there's really only 201 with little bits of 202 and 203.
Call them courses, but
courses, they're just the step levels as you go up. And so there are about 5 more courses, you would say. But what was most interesting about Davison's measurements is that the top course, 206, was dramatically taller than the courses below it. It's almost twice as tall. And so that was like sort of a huge interesting point where it's like, why? And you can see here a graph, right? There's Davison's measurement of course 206 versus all the course heights as you go all the way up. And so this was well known in history because his notes had been published by another author in the early 1800s. But I think everyone kind of has just assumed that Davison was wrong, because it was like, well, why? It's quite natural to assume, oh yeah, the courses would just get smaller as you went higher because that's an easier way to build. But I then found other testimonies corroborating Davison that said, oh yeah, no, it was thick at the top. It was thick up to course 206. And indeed, some people that don't even measure, they're talking about, oh, the summit stones are really big and beautiful, right? And when you just hear that, you don't, without a reference, you think, oh, they're just sort of commenting on how nice it is to be at the top. But no, they were like, there's some really big blocks at the top of the Great Pyramid. And so later, I actually was concerned that maybe there were some notes that Davison had taken that didn't make it into the historical record. So I actually went to Stanford University's Special Collections Library that has his original diaries from the 1700s, and actually went there in person.
Wow.
And was like, hold on, we got to go to the source material.
Wow.
And so you'll see that little diagram there next to my thumb. And that is course 206 as he drew it in 1765.
That's original.
That's original, yeah. Wow. Older than the U.S. Constitution.
Jesus.
I was like trying not to shake, I was like, oh, don't tear this, Doug.
They give that to anybody?
Be careful.
Anybody
you have to they have a special room and you can't bring anything into the room, right? You can't bring food and, or it's just sort of you and your computer and a pencil, right?
Wow.
And so...
that's beautiful handwriting, by the way.
I had to take pictures of everything because it's so hard to read that you don't have, I'd be at the library for, a year straight, trying to decipher it. So I took pictures of all the relevant pages so I could do the research at home. And so what's great about this little map is it's a real snapshot of what the summit, that big course 206 looked like in 1765. It's kind of haphazard. You can see that a few stones have fallen here, have come off here and there.
We got to get this in front of AI. In about 5 years, when AI is able to just fully decipher, a long book and just give you, the pull points and give you 20 things that you haven't thought of and, give you 10 different things to consider about the discovery. I mean, all of this information, that's why AI is so good at deciphering a ton of information.
There will be a huge revolution in doing historical research when the AI can transcribe this well.
Yes.
Because it's just so much work to do manually.
Yes.
So this was kind of fun and interesting, but actually the real surprise came later when there were a few other testimonies that I found. A group of 3 gentlemen went to the Great Pyramid in about 1750, 1751. They were Robert Wood, James Dawkins, and Giovanni Bora. And they also, I also was able to read Dawkins' original diary from that time. And Dawkins' work had never been published in a book. It was in some diary in scribbled handwriting, and that was it, right? It was basically completely unnoticed. And Dawkins says that big block that Davison drew was about 6.5 feet square on each side. And you read that and you're like, so these blocks are already super thick, right? And now we've got a block that's not just thick, but it's abnormally large lengthwise and widthwise. And that would, if his measurements were correct, that would put the block at over 10 tons.
Wow.
And that was it's one of those things that you're like, could this really be true?
Yeah.
But being sort of with dogged determination, I was like, I've got to have more evidence to back this up. And so I did find 2 more testimonies corroborating those numbers. One was a gentleman named Michael Eneman, who went in 1711, and another was one of Dawkins' companions who was sort of doing his own research independently. They traveled together, but they each had their own notebooks, and they were each doing their own thing. And that was Giovanni Bora. And Bora even goes one step farther, where he draws a sketch of the top 3 layers of the Great Pyramid at that time. So that's, of course, 206, 205, 204, with measurements of every length of every stone. So it's basically a technical diagram of a missing piece of a wonder of the ancient world. And that was just, I couldn't believe like something like that just existed in some notebook out there, right? I mean, in a video I talk about, it'd be like finding like a sketch of, the Temple of Artemis or something, something that's just like
Hawara.
Like it would be like, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
So anyway, and maybe we can bring a picture up of his sketch or, so I took those measurements, and with the help of Keith Hamilton, we did some 3D reconstruction overlays of what the Great Pyramid looked like before the top came off. But the real amazing thing about, in particular, so that's a top-down view.
Current.
Yeah. So the sort of 3 top layers there are the courses that are gone, and then the 3 under it are what exists today.
How tightly interlocked would those stones be if not for human intervention, earthquakes, etc.?
It's a great question. So if you look at the top-down view, you see there's 2 little squares right above the southern block, the block at the bottom, and those are little filler spacer blocks that were cemented in. So they weren't. These are still core regular blocks, presumably, and so they were still probably fairly roughly made, at least compared to casing stones. They didn't feel like they needed to lock the core super tight. But that actually makes this big block even more remarkable, because pretty much every construction theory to the Great Pyramid assumes that you can kind of cheat the blocks at the top a bit more if they're small, right?
Right.
You can have steeper ramps or tighter tolerances. But if they're just taking regular core blocks up that are 10 tons, that pretty much throws all of those ideas away, right? Like they would never do that if like space was a constraining factor, right? Like why there doesn't seem to be any logic. I mean, at least to us, right? Why make it so hard on yourself?
Yeah.
And it also says that they could have built the entire pyramid out of blocks of that size. If they can get them up that high,
sure.
People like to always downplay the size of the blocks. They're like, yeah, there's some big blocks, but most of them are, they're only about 1.5, 2 tons. And it's like, yeah, that's true. It was clearly more efficient to do it that way, but they didn't have to do it that way. They could have made the whole pyramid out of huge stones like that,
for sure.
Which was a very sort of profound and humbling realization for me personally.
It's huge. And so the ultimate question then, of course, is why?
Why?
Yeah.
Why make them that big? Or
why did they bring that stone, that 10-ton stone,
why
up
did they
to
bring
the
it
top?
up? Yeah. I mean, I would guess that they were trying to sort of make sort of a mini foundation for the very apex of the pyramid. I think it's reasonable to assume that the Tura casing stones started if not right above that course, very close to it. And at the top of the pyramid, if you look at the top of Khafre's pyramid, you can see how the very top casing stones have little bevels cut into them so that the blocks will interlock, so that they won't be, any sort of slight lateral forces aren't going to cause the blocks to come tumbling off the pyramid. Or when they're installing them, it's also sort of like a little stopper, so you don't, if you push the block too far, right, a foot too far, now you've got a huge problem. So there's the top of Khafre's pyramid, and so.
I guess I just wonder, like, 6.5 by 6.5. It's very, very direct and very exact, and it's up there, and it's a little bit off center right now. I just wonder, like, where was it originally? Could it have been in the exact center, and could they have needed that much of a solid cube at the very top to support the capstone?
Yeah, it's hard to say how much those blocks might have been nudged around a little bit. When they ripped the casing stones off, they were pretty rough on the pyramid, and so certainly, if it was convenient to nudge something around, they would have done so.
Earthquakes,
or
whatever.
Like the top of Khafre's pyramid. If you look down one of the angles, the casing stones have a little bit of a twist to it, but that could just be from later earthquakes. It could still have been quite straight originally.
If you're up there at the top of the pyramid and an earthquake starts going on, that 10-ton block, you'll just be able to push it, right along. It'll just bounce itself right along to the edge there. So I don't know, just an idea, but that's interesting. So here we are. We've got a 10-ton block at the top of the Great Pyramid, and it's just an incredible amount of work would have been, done to get this thing up there and to put it into position. And so, what is your thought, your best guess? Like really, why did they do this? It's support, right? I mean, it's the support question.
They clearly thought, we'll big blocks are more structurally stable, and so we'll here at the top,
okay.
I think they're just trying to add stability up there. There doesn't seem to be any other logical reason that I can understand in the present day why they would do that, and it still seems kind of insane to do it anyway, right? Sure. You'd think that they would know that they didn't have to do that. The top of the pyramid would still probably be fine if they'd used regular 2-ton stones up there. But, they wanted to go to the extra mile. And it was something that no one was ever going to be able to see or appreciate, right? That block was hidden inside the pyramid until all the casing stones came off. And the amazing part is, to them, it was just kind of no big deal. Otherwise, I don't think they would have done it.
Yeah, totally. Do we have any idea of how what the dimensions of the capstone would have been to compare to that stone, to try to kind of see if that theory of, maybe this was the block that the capstone sat on top of at one point?
Well, I always, the way I always approach the analysis of the pyramids is I'm always trying to compare them to each other, right? Because any one pyramid will have parts that are missing or damaged, and who knows? Once it's gone, who knows, right? But I always try to use the other pyramids as a reference point. And so looking at the top of Khafre's pyramid, which has still got its casing stones, there's only space for about 5 regular courses of stone, and each course of stone being about half a meter. So we're talking, there's only 2.5 meters of blocks that are missing at the top of Khafre. And so I sort of feel like the most probable size for a capstone would be 2 to 3 courses in height. So, 1 to 2 meters. But, geometry wise, because it's a point, it's a mini pyramid, it's not going to be, its volume is probably going to be less than like that 10.5 stone.
Yeah.
But that, or at least comparable. It's not going to be much bigger than that, in my opinion, based upon looking at what we see at Khafre.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, if it's 3 to 6 feet tall on the capstone, and that works. I mean, it does that could work. Because you're talking about a base that's probably 5-6 feet long, I guess, right? So yeah, interesting. Okay, so what else on the Great Pyramid then? Where do we go from there?
Where do we go?
Yeah.
I guess I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the air channels. When I was first getting to know the Great Pyramid, the air channels were extremely interesting, just because there's no other pyramid has them. There's 4 of them. They just sort of force you to try to imagine like what's hiding inside the pyramid, right? Because you can't see inside them. I mean, now we have modern robots that can climb up them, but they were just very tantalizing in that respect. It seemed like there was something really interesting and important about them. And so, I was always sympathetic to the conventional view that they were for air, because they work very well for air. But I was still always open to other ideas. It wasn't that didn't seem to be a slam dunk in the beginning when I first started studying them. It seemed like something that was definitely possible, but there were things that there were confusing parts because the Queen's Chamber channels were sealed. They were sealed on the inside and they were sealed on the outside. And everyone's like, well, how can they be for air if they're sealed, right? You need...
That's what's going through my head right now.
Yeah, they need to be open. So that was a very sort of tough mental barrier to sort of overcome in thinking about them being for air. But one of the most important clues, again, came from a historical testimony. John Perring, in 1837, he was with Howard Weiss when they did a major investigation of the pyramids. And in doing some of these investigations, they were a little rougher on the pyramid than I think they ought to have been. A little bit of sort of black powder, sort of proto dynamite was used here and there. And at that time, they were interested in the air channels too. It wasn't known if they connected to anything else in the pyramid or what they were really for. And so they went up there with boring rods and started, cleaning them out. They did the North Channel first. The North King's Chamber channel is the one that gets clogged because it's the longest. It's also got the shallowest incline, and it also has a big sort of rough cavity at its opening on the outside. So it's just very easy for rain and debris and sand to constantly plug it up. So that one was probably plugged up very easily. And so they spent many weeks working on getting that thing unplugged. It was a huge job for them, probably not a fun job. And so then they go to the south side, and they with that mindset, they're like, "Oh man, this is going to be another huge job." And so they they demolish the pyramid sort of around the air channel to create a working platform for their boring rods. So
at what part of the at the bottom or at the top?
At the top. At the top. We're boring in from the top down.
Yep.
And so here's a picture of John. This is a picture of what John Perring drew in 1837. And so in doing this, they removed this block here that you see that Perring is drawing where the label A is. And so the air channel as it exists today is pretty much the same except for this one block. And they had to take this last block off because they really wanted to get a nice sharp angle for the boring rods to bore in. And of course, irony of ironies, the southern air channel was barely plugged. There was really only one loose roundish stone that was in there. And once they plucked that one out, it was totally fine. So they didn't actually have to do all of this destruction. If they'd just been a little more patient, we would still have this stone. But John Perring was a really talented researcher. He didn't try to judge what he was looking at. He just sort of wrote and drew what he saw. And what you saw here at the southern channel was that there's just enough of this last block, which is now gone, that you could tell that the channel did not continue to point out straight towards the sky. It bent back parallel towards the casing stones, basically. And this is a huge clue. Now, I don't know why Egyptology has dismissed this testimony. No one ever tries to explain why Perring would have been wrong. And I think it's because there's not really any good reason to think that he would have been wrong. He was very, very good, very reliable. He would have gotten a very close look at this evidence here. But his sketch is a little crude, and I think maybe on account of the sketch not being too detailed, they're just like, well, we want him to be wrong, so maybe he was wrong.
Yeah.
But if the channel's pointing towards going back to horizontal, we're not. This isn't like some, a lot of the sort of spiritual explanation is that, we're pointing, the pharaoh's soul to the sky, leading to the stars. And that is part of the Egyptian, mythology. But that's not what was going on here, right? The channels were not, the King's Chamber channels at least, were not pointed to the sky. They were pointed, they leveled out. And so that to me was a huge clue that, well, why would you do that, right? Well, because if they're going to be open to have air flow through, you don't want it pointed up because that's going to make it so much easier for rain and sand and winds to get it clogged, right?
Sure.
You're just like inside the chamber where they level out to horizontal, they're leveling them out at the exterior of the pyramid. And they could have put, some sort of they could have it curved down a little bit. There's a lot of little cheats that they could do to make sure that nothing was going to come in and plug the air channels at that altitude. And so that was a huge clue. But there was, sorry.
It was that drawing of that stone on the edge. So for that drawing for me, I mean, if you draw those dotted lines, that don't exist, if you
Yeah.
draw them horizontally, it makes it look like, it goes up and then it goes out probably, because there's that little curve at the top of that stone that he drew, just very, very minor, very minor.
It's painful that that Pairing doesn't say exactly what it was about the stone that explained that it went to horizontal. And I think that window of doubt has given a lot of people the excuse to say, well, maybe he just got it wrong.
Sure.
But I don't see any reason. I mean, he would have been up there looking at it very closely, right? And he probably knew that they were about to destroy this block for their drilling operation. And so I think that was sort of his way of there was probably a little bit of like, you know what, I should really write this down because once this block's gone, nobody's going to know which direction the air channel was pointed.
Right.
I think that's probably why he did it.
Okay, but it makes total sense that if the channel goes, if you put those dotted lines and you draw them at a 45-degree angle, I'm like, yep, that's a 45-degree angle all the way out to the Torah. If you put them at a half, I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, sure, that makes sense too. But it's like, so the mystery deepens, I guess. But it's kind of like, what do you, it's not conclusive necessarily, but it's like logically, okay, if they, of course they needed air shafts in here, there's these shafts that are going up to the top. Why wouldn't they be air shafts? I think is kind of your perspective, right?
Well, there's another key clue that I uncovered. I think it's probably the most important clue, actually, as much as Pairing's clue is super important. I think there's one more clue that really sort of ends the debate, in my opinion, and that's that the King's Chamber air channel, the northern one, not the southern one. The southern one's very damaged in the chamber because people wanted to know where it went, and so they hacked away at it till it was a large enough space to where you could crawl through deep enough to look up, right? And then when you look up, you're like, okay, it's not, there's nothing nearby.
Yeah.
But the north shaft is still in good shape inside the chamber. And if you look very closely at the end of the north air channel where it enters the chamber, you can see how they cut the channel. You can see that in some places they used a flat saw, and in some places like if you look here on the left side, which is the west side, we've got a flat corner, a squared corner. On the right side, we have a rounded corner, right? And then so they used some sort of flat saw to cut certain parts of the channel, but not the whole bit. The upper part of the wall on the right is cut with a flat saw, and the lower half of the floor, the left side of the floor is cut with a flat saw. But the flat saw cut here in the air channel does not go all the way to the edge. It stops, 10 to 15 centimeters before it reaches the edge. And then you see it turns into that rounded sort of tube drill type edge shape. It might not have been a tube drill, but it's curved kind of like a tube drill. And so, if you're cutting the stone, granite is very hard to cut. Why would you stop sawing 10 centimeters before you got to the edge of the block, right? That makes it so much harder to do. I mean, anyone who's cut with a straight saw knows, like you want to you really want to be able to get use the inertia of the saw and go all the way through. But they didn't do that. They stopped the saw cut before they got to the edge. And so my interpretation of this evidence is that, like the Queen's Chamber, the King's Chamber channels were originally uncut at inside the chamber when they first installed the blocks. And then after the chamber was essentially mostly complete, then they did that last step of cutting open the air channels. And that's why the Queen's Chamber channels were still sealed, right? It's a direct apples to apples comparison where the Queen's Chamber is just basically slightly unfinished. And that's why the air channels don't penetrate all the way to the chamber or to the outside.
Okay. But then why Gantenbrink's door? Why the copper pins? Why?
So, my model understanding of the pyramid is not necessarily that the Queen's Chamber is a backup burial chamber. Its purpose is still somewhat mysterious, but you can see that the Queen's Chamber is unfinished in other ways. It doesn't have pavement in the floor. The passage leading to it does not have pavement. The threshold to where you would enter the chamber is still sort of rough. There's still like this. They leave a little bit of extra stone at the corners because corners are always what get damaged if you're moving construction materials. You're carrying, and so they leave those last sensitive pieces to be finished last. And so, you know, Gantenbrink's door, I would say, is just, as they were building the pyramid, they have to keep the air channels sealed because otherwise they're going to get clogged, you know, with rain, sand, and debris as well. They want to keep them. They don't want to have to take the trouble to try and clear them out because it's very difficult. And so they would have kept the channels plugged at each stage as they were building the pyramid upwards. And I think by the time that they got to the level of Gantenbrink's door, which is almost to the outside of the pyramid, it's only, I think, 10 to 15 meters before it would have exited the pyramid. I think that it's at that point where they decided, okay, we're not actually going to use the Queen's Chamber. It's only going to be, the King's Chamber is really going to be the only functionally used space inside the pyramid. And the door or slab is really just a stone that they used to seal it up while they were building the pyramid, and they just left it in place.
Okay.
I know that's kind of a banal explanation, but I think that makes the most sense.
Okay. Yeah, I love it. So then, I mean, in terms of and I think there's a few more components of the Great Pyramid that I want to get into with you, but
Sure.
the overall kind of purpose function of the pyramid, if there was any function at all, you know, or are you on the tomb theory side? Are you on the what are your thoughts?
So, that's always kind of a loaded question. You know, it's a tomb, but it's much more than that, right? Okay. It's, you know, I'm still very much in the camp that, you know, the pyramids are all funerary monuments relating to the ancient Egyptians' belief in the afterlife. You know, but, you know, our picture of the past is always so oversimplified, right? The past is always going to be far more complex than we can possibly imagine because we have so little to go on to reconstruct it. And, you know, so my understanding of the pyramid as a tomb is that it is a tomb in the sense that there's a sarcophagus, and clearly that's designed for a pharaoh to be interred in at some point. But that doesn't mean that that's the end of the story, that it's like you stick the body in there, you close it up, and you say, okay, job's done. Everyone, you know, we'll worship at the temple, but, you know, the pyramid's completed. That's not my view. My view is that, starting with the Great Pyramid in particular, that there would be ongoing access and worship inside the pyramid. And the air channels are, I think, a very sort of intuitive clue that's what's going on, because you wouldn't need air channels just for like a one-time funeral, right? Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, I'm sure it'd be a bit stuffy, but they wouldn't have gone to the trouble to put that in if it wasn't like seriously important. And the only reason it would be important is if you were going to have people coming in there for a long period of time. And so I sort of see the pyramid as more like a temple or a church or a cathedral than just, you know, a place to stash a body.
Okay. So then, I mean, in terms of the when, you know, when were these built? Because I guess, you know, you're talking about it being incomplete, and so do you before we get to the when, maybe like why do you think that it wasn't completed?
Why didn't they finish like the Queen's Chamber or the underground chamber?
Yeah.
You know, that's obviously very tough to know. You know, you see, if you sort of, in order to understand that, you kind of have to go back to the earlier pyramids of Snefru, which was Khufu's father. He built 3 enormous ones, and you can see that they're sort of rapidly evolving their idea of, you know, what a pyramid should be. And in my opinion, actually, the Great Pyramid is actually really the first pyramid where they planned to have the pharaoh be buried within it, at least in a within the structure itself. Snefru's pyramids don't have any sarcophagi inside of them. That's a huge anomaly in the sense that the stone sarcophagi are pretty resilient. Even if they're smashed, they're a different kind of stone than the rest of the pyramid. Like, you're going to find a scrap, a piece, you know, something to indicate that it was there. And every pyramid, and I must reiterate this, every king's pyramid in the Old Kingdom, no matter how bad of a condition it is, has pieces of a stone sarcophagus in it, except the 3 Snefru pyramids. All 3 of Snefru's have not a single fragment. And that's just a little bit too much to be a coincidence for me personally. And so I think, and so in that sense, in evolving from Snefru's pyramids, which I think were still related to, his funerary afterlife, but they weren't necessarily where his body was going to be placed. And then that changes with the introduction of the Great Pyramid. I think that sort of speaks to the fact that they're still rapidly changing their ideas or evolving their thinking about, well, what is the final vision here? And so I think like the Queen's Chamber and the subterranean chamber were designed to be chambers where people would go in to do various activities related to worshiping the pharaoh. I think the underground chamber was probably more of a storage space. It's the largest chamber. It's got a little vestibule, which is like a little chamber right before the entrance, and similar to how later pyramids have those. And I think that one was like, okay, if we're going to stash a bunch of stuff, that's where we're going to do it. And I think the Queen's Chamber was, if we're going to worship the pharaoh but not in the King's Chamber directly, we would do it in the Queen's Chamber. And I think ultimately it was decided, no, we're just gonna have people sometimes go all the way into the most sacred space of the pyramid directly to engage in their cultural activities, so to speak.
Okay. And then in terms of like the construction of it and the how, because I mean, you're talking about bringing 60, 80 ton granite blocks into the, 300 feet up in the air, whatever. People, it's, I guess if you can do it with, it's so how, how did they drag those across the Nile, across the desert, across, up the pyramid? How did the Egyptians do that?
Well, I don't know that's starting to get out of my realm of expertise, right? I think it's always kind of very mysterious, like how they would get them on and off the boats, right? I will say that
every 5 minutes for 25 years, working every minute of the day.
The size of the granite beams in
you're talking the big ones.
The big ones. The size of them
boats.
does get exaggerated a little bit in the sense that, yes, there is one that might be about 80 tons, but most of them are actually about half that. Most of them are 35, 40 tons. It's still very impressive, but it's easy to get carried away with thinking that they're bigger than they were. I think at that elevation on the pyramid, you could still get those up with the sort of conventional model of understanding where, you could have a long and straight enough ramp that you could still get those blocks up, pulling them on sleds. You don't have to do anything too tricky. You're not turning corners or navigating tight tolerances. And, a nice big ramp is the fastest way to get a lot of blocks up. But at some point, the strategy had to change. And I would say that probably once you get higher than on the Great Pyramid than those big stones, they were doing something different. They had a different way of bringing them up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to know. I don't know either. I mean, obviously nobody knows, but the internal ramp theory is kind of cool.
Great credit to Jean-Pierre Houdin for coming up with that theory. I think, I really admired Houdin in the sense that he proved that, people could just sort of really tackle the big problems on their own, that there was enough resources out there, in our digital world to do that. And so, that was a big inspiration. I think his approach, is trying to see it in an idealized perspective, like what would be the most efficient way to build the Great Pyramid, and which is extremely useful. But just because his way is the most efficient way, perhaps the most efficient way to do it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was the way to do it, right? So I think that's a great place to sort of start from, and then build off of.
It's true, because levitation is much more efficient. I mean, let's just admit that right now. No.
Well, I'll tell you what, though. Going back to the historical stuff, Herodotus, which is our oldest account of the Great Pyramid, he says that they used, some sort of like wooden type machines that would raise blocks from like one tier to the next. And Herodotus says some things too that we definitely know not to be true. It's always you always sort of wonder, well, how reliable was his information back then? But especially in thinking about that 10-ton block at course 206, I do find myself, sort of leaning in that direction more and more, where I was like, they probably did have, I won't say probably, they may have had something sort of that, like a primitive version of a crane that used, proto pulleys and a lot of ropes and rigging to haul blocks up in a way that we just can't know of, because all that stuff's long gone. It's not like the stones which preserve and tell us. Any kind of wooden, any kind of infrastructure that's based on scaffolding and ropes, we can't reconstruct. And so I think a lot of people who try to solve the problem don't want to go down that route, because it just becomes entirely speculative. It's like, well, there's a lot of ways that you can use ropes and scaffolding, but I think there's probably some truth to what Herodotus was saying.
Okay, and then there's on the outside of the pyramids, I don't know how many, but definitely the Great Pyramid. I think you've got those walls. The
enclosure walls?
Yeah, the enclosure walls. Yeah. What are your thoughts on those? Why? And are they on like most of the pyramids, or are they on?
Yeah, every pretty much they all have big enclosure walls. What's fascinating about the enclosure walls is people tended to think of, people who are still in the idea that we're defending the body of a pharaoh with the pyramid. People always think of the pyramid as like the defensive mechanism is in of itself, right? So if you're already fortifying something with a pyramid, like, why do you need a wall around it? But I think that actually, as I spoke to a little bit earlier, if the pyramids are, still mostly accessible to some degree for the cult of the pharaoh to enter, then you do need another protective barrier around the pyramid, right? You don't want people just, wandering, through the desert and able to sneak into the inner sanctum. And so I sort of just think of them as a defensive barrier to keep out intruders. It's kind of like, Khafre, the second pyramid at Giza, like, he puts granite casing stones on the lowest level of his pyramid. But, once you've got a wall around that, like, nobody, that's a lot of work to then just hide behind a wall, right? So the walls were definitely important. I think otherwise they're sort of like obscuring some of the more interesting parts of the pyramid to people who aren't like right in front of them.
Is there any world in your mind where it's possible that they could have been water at the base of the pyramid that was held in by those enclosure walls? Are they watertight? Would they be able to?
So I do believe that you can see at the edges at the corners in particular of some of the enclosure walls that they did have drainage that could exit them, because I'm sure they would have found rainfall very inconvenient, right? It would pool water, a ton of water would run off the pyramid inside the enclosure. And I don't think it happened often, but you do see sort of drainage infrastructure, at the pyramids and at the temples next to them. So they were. I think the evidence is that they were managing that like we would today. Yeah, I think it would pool. I don't know how high, if the enclosure wall was nice and tight, but I think there's pretty clear archaeological evidence that they had methods to get the water out.
Okay. Yeah. Gotcha. All right, cool. So what else on the Great, is there, before we move on, are there any big mysteries for you on the Great Pyramid, or anything else that you find highly fascinating?
I mean, there's, of course there's a lot that's fascinating. One of the key points that I enjoyed investigating about the Great Pyramid was the portcullis, which is the sort of defensive obstruction right before you enter the king's chamber. What I found fascinating about portcullises is that, portcullises had been used by ancient Egypt, long before the pyramids, at least a few dynasties before they started building pyramids, as, like a underground burial would have a big, heavy, stone of a harder substance than the surrounding material that would be harder to penetrate. So there would be like a primitive tomb robber, you might not have the tools to get through a harder stone. And, but the portcullises are very different in pyramids than they are in the rock-cut tombs, in the sense that in the underground tombs, they could backfill the portcullis so that it couldn't be moved, right? You've got all this material. Once it's lowered, you fill in it from above. And here's a picture of where the Great Pyramid's portcullis used to be. And so it seems to me that the portcullises in the pyramids were quite a bit more vulnerable than than the older style. And actually, probably one of the most interesting things is that the first portcullis you see in a pyramid is in the bent pyramid. And the bent pyramid actually sort of perfects, I think, the portcullis design right from the beginning, where instead of a slab that's coming down top to bottom and just sort of sitting on the floor, it comes at a transverse or diagonal angle, and it goes down to a level beneath the floor. And this is a great design because you can't lever it back up, right? You don't really know which direction it came from. And so if you were to try to like lever it out of place, the amount of material you'd have to dig and excavate it'd take you longer to do that than it would just to be to plow through the portcullis directly. And this is the same portcullis design that after the Old Kingdom, later in Egypt, in the Middle Kingdom, they use this portcullis design pretty much exclusively, right? So they had gotten it right from the very beginning, but then they don't use that design. And conspicuously, one of the portcullises in the bent pyramid, the one that leads to the upper chamber, is never closed. It's still open to this day, right? They had thought about sealing it forever, but they did not. And so that's a huge red flag, right? like that tells you that, okay, something about our understanding about what was going on is not true, because this is supposed to be like the most important thing to do is to protect what's inside the pyramid, and here they're leaving the door wide open. And at the Great Pyramid, they radically redesign it again, so they've got three vertical blocks, three blocks that are coming down from a vertical position, one right after the other. And so you sort of were like, well, they'd already sort of perfected the design that they then decided not to use. Like, why are we changing things up so much? And the Great Pyramid portcullis is also extremely vulnerable in the sense that you can just crawl over the blocks, at least two of the three blocks, once they're lowered into place. When the portcullis was first damaged, however many millennia ago, that's exactly what they did. You can see the damage leading to the king's chamber, where they just hammered away at the tunnel and the top of the inner portcullis to break through. They didn't, 90% of the portcullis could just be bypassed. And so that's also like very confusing. Like, these guys were clearly quite smart. Surely they knew that there was like a vulnerability here. And my understanding is that the reason the portcullis is made this way is so they can repeatedly open and close it. Is that it's not. Yeah, there's a diagram of the portcullises in their open and closed position. It's not like a one-time deal where you close it and then you're done, right? It's more like a lockable door than a permanently sealed tomb with this kind of device. And so the big clue, if you go back to that old black and white picture of Morton Edgar's brother crawling through it, the biggest piece of evidence for me was you see how in the floor there next to his feet, it goes below the level of the floor, right? You see there's a hole there. So originally, as they're building the pyramid, they have to have these portcullises on. Keep going below.
Down to the right?
Even down further.
Down to the right,
Yeah,
you mean?
to the right. Yeah, to the right.
That's
the
left.
left. There we go. There's a big old hole there, right?
Keep going, Ryan. Zoom out a little bit, man. There you go. Mm-hmm. Now go down and right onto that hole on the ground.
This hole is really interesting because, they're going to keep the portcullis propped up on supports until it's time to close it, and they'll do that at every portcullis, after the Great Pyramid in the Old Kingdom as well. But but the Great Pyramid is the only pyramid that has these slots underneath the level of the floor. And if your model of the portcullis is that it's a one-time closure, you can sort of imagine them like yanking out the supports, the block falling, and then you're done. But if the supports are embedded under the level of the floor, you cannot pull them out with the weight of the portcullis on top of them, right? The only way you can pull these supports out to let the portcullis down is to lift it. And the portcullis in the Great Pyramid you can see the blocks have holes for ropes, and so they had to have mastered the ability to generate enough force to lift with ropes to lift those blocks off the supports in order to lower them. And if you can lift them one time, hell, you can keep lifting them and closing them repeatedly at will. And so that's what I think was going on with the portcullises. That's why they're there. They're a lockable door, not an internal closure, so to speak.
Cool. My last question on the Great Pyramid, and it'll probably apply to most of the pyramids, I think.
Okay.
Is what percentage chance are you convinced that this was built by Khafre Khufu in that time period?
I think we can be pretty darn confident. They've approached studying the age of them from many different angles. They've carbon dated carbon in the mortar between the blocks. They have the ochre inscriptions of Khufu inside the Great Pyramid, and all of Khufu's relatives are buried next to the pyramid, right? So a lot of people are like, well, what if the Egyptians, sort of the question is like, what if they appropriated the pyramids, from some other civilization that had built them? But my sort of answer to that is, well, if that was the case, why did the earliest pharaohs not take the best pyramids, right? We can be very confident about the general order of the pharaohs because we have various kings lists that tell us, then first came Djoser, and then Sekemket, and then eventually you get Snefru, and then Khufu, and Khafre. And that's in the historic tradition too. Even the Greeks knew which pharaohs were associated with the 3 pyramids at Giza. And so, the fact that it all lines up, the evidence for each pharaoh at each pyramid lines up in the same order that you would expect them to be in terms of, the kings lists. That just seems to, I can't imagine that, Djoser would say, you know what, I don't want the Great Pyramid. I'm going to take the stepped pyramid instead, if they're just coming and moving in, so to speak, instead of building them themselves.
I do want to understand, though, in terms of a percentage, like, are you 100%? Are you 99%? Are you 90? Where are you?
For Khufu being
yes.
I don't have any doubt. I would say I guess nothing's ever truly 100. I would say I'm 99% sure that Khufu is the builder of the Great Pyramid. Now, in terms of if he actually ended up inside the pyramid permanently, that's a different question, I feel like. They were, the elites at that time were doing some very interesting things with tomb security leading from Snefru to Khufu, where you can make a reasonably strong case to say that maybe he ultimately decided to be buried secretly somewhere else instead of inside the Great Pyramid. And that idea, that tradition goes all the way back to our earliest accounts. Like, I think Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus, particularly Diodorus Siculus, who's, in the Roman era, I think he's about 100 AD. He says it right there in his books that, that the great kings at Giza, Khufu, and Khafre were not buried in their pyramids because they feared that, eventually, the people of the country would come and, despoil them. And so they ultimately, despite using their pyramids for, power and influence and sort of divine inspiration, they opted to be somewhere else. And in fact, and that's not even that controversial of an opinion in Egyptology. There's an Egyptologist right now excavating in the Western Cemetery at Giza who thinks that he's looking for Khufu. He thinks that Khufu was not left inside the Great Pyramid. So there's I think there's some nuance there in terms of that side of the story.
Yeah, gotcha. Cool. All right, very good. That was an excellent overview on your thoughts on the Great, and I know that the Bent Pyramid for you is probably equally as important as the Great Pyramid.
It's definitely a close runner-up.
Yeah. Okay.
The Bent Pyramid. We're really, really, really lucky to have the Bent Pyramid. It's so special. It's the only pyramid that still has most of its casing stones intact, still physically attached to the pyramid. And, in terms of people that are interested in figuring out how they were built, I think those casing stones are going to give us the best clue to actually figure out at least get a reasonable idea as to how it was done. I think the information that's in those casing stones is really the main key to figuring out how it was done. And so that alone is spectacular. The bent pyramid, because of its unique shape, gets kind of a bad rap in Egyptology and archaeology. It's sometimes assumed to be like sort of a construction mistake, like they didn't quite know how to build a pyramid yet. Maybe they changed the angle at the top because they were not confident about how it was going to hold up.
Does that seem like the most ridiculous thing you've heard yet today?
Well, here
that's an accident.
It's a classic historian's fallacy, and this is why the earliest pyramids have been, I think, such a thorn in the side of Egyptology, is that you can't project backwards to really have the same understanding. Like, yes, we have a much better understanding about what was going on in pyramids that come after the bent. But just because no pyramid after the bent looks like the bent, that doesn't mean that it was a mistake in its time, right? I kind of, of the three pyramids that Snefru built, a lot of Egyptologists favor the red pyramid as being his funerary pyramid, because the evidence suggests that it was probably the last one that he built, or at least it was finished last. But if you like, as a thought exercise, if Egyptian civilization ended after Snefru, like if Snefru was the last pharaoh, there are no more pyramids after Snefru. Looking at all the archaeological evidence at this pyramid at Djoser, like all of the temple and the satellite pyramid and the causeway, it all goes to the bent pyramid. It doesn't go to the red pyramid. And so just as a thought exercise, if you think of it that way, the bent pyramid's clearly the most important pyramid in Snefru's time, I think, based upon what you see going on at the site. But one thing that I was quite pleased to discover about the bent pyramid when I visited and took some very high-res zoomed-in photographs is that the bend in the pyramid is not structural. It's purely aesthetic, meaning that if you look very closely at the stones at the bend is cut directly into the stones themselves. It's not. Sometimes it's a separation between one course to the next, but sometimes it's not. Like the courses are. The bent pyramid's a little bit more cavalier in terms of how it was built than the later pyramids, in that they don't keep the courses perfectly straight. They allow them, I guess, for convenience sake, to drift a little bit, especially as you get higher. And so they had finished the pyramid, they had cased it, and then as they're dressing the casing to get that nice smooth finish, the line of the bend is independent of the blocks themselves. Some blocks will have the bend like right in the middle, some will be at the joint, some will be like just a few inches off of the joint. Wow. And so it's really a sort of a to me, that says that it's more of like, there you can see the bend right in the middle of the stones. Wow. And no one had seen this, or at least no one had documented it until I did about 2 to 3 years ago.
Huh. Okay.
Like this pyramid's been sitting there for everyone to see for 4,500 years, and no one had seen this.
Right. Everybody was assuming it was just the way that they placed the blocks as opposed to cutting the individuals.
Right. Nobody bothered to look, which seems crazy to me, but that's pyramid studies for you.
Interesting.
And so this I thought was fairly profound to show that, it's not, this doesn't necessarily mean 100% that the pyramid, that they couldn't have changed their minds and shallowed the angle as they were building the pyramid, but it seems like a pretty good blow against that idea. Another thing about the bent pyramid, which they give it a bad rap for, is that the casing stones are not perfectly level like they are in later pyramids. They're still sloping. They're sort of inclined a little bit. The whole of the pyramid is built level, but the casing stones are sort of at a sort of an inward angle into the pyramid.
I'm not following. I'm sorry.
All right, so you imagine you're just stacking blocks nice and level. That's how almost all of the pyramid is built, except for the outermost blocks. They sort of tilt them so that instead of being the same as the blocks that are inside the pyramid, that they're at about a 10 to 15 degree angle, with pointed up, right? You can't see that just looking straight on the pyramid. But when you see the blocks that are exposed and you see it from the side, you can see that they're all sort of tilted inwards.
Okay.
And so this is how the earliest, like Djoser's step pyramid has the blocks tilted inwards as well, right? They're not level. And so the idea was, oh well, that's the old way they used to build, and then eventually they sort of figure out that they don't need to do that, and they start making them perfectly level. And so that's another reason why they say, oh well, maybe the bent pyramid they hadn't quite figured out everything, because above the bend the blocks are much more level and even. They're still not perfectly level. They're still maybe a few degrees off of being horizontal, but they're close. But the lower ones are much more inclined. And so the old idea was that, oh well, they just sort of figured out that tilting the blocks inward was not helping or maybe causing other problems. And so once they got their act together, they made the angle shallower, they made the blocks even, and they finished the pyramid. But there is a testimony, again, from our heroes, Robert Wood, James Dawkins, and Giovanni Bora. The Red Pyramid used to have a lot more casing stones intact on the pyramid. And James Dawkins, who visited the Red Pyramid and climbed to the top again back in the 1750s, he said that the casing stones on that pyramid were also inclined the same way they were at the bent pyramid. Now, at the bottom of the Red Pyramid, they are flat. But he says somewhere higher up, they were sloping in just like the bent pyramid. And so you can't really say that like one way is superior or inferior necessarily between the two pyramids. And in fact, the casing stones at the bent pyramid are much larger than they are than the Red Pyramid. Their longest dimension is depth. They go really deep into the pyramid. That's probably one of the reasons why they're still holding on. It's just harder for them to break and fall off. And so you can't looking at the construction of the two pyramids, there's no clear reason why either one of those pyramid designs would be inherently superior or more advanced than the other. They just have their own idiosyncrasies.
Yeah, and then one of the more interesting things we were talking about at dinner last night was the heat expansion.
Yes, the thermal expansion.
Yeah. Walk us through that.
So Peter James was an engineer who led the company, I believe it was Syntec, who repaired some of the pyramids about 15 to 20 years ago. Particularly the step pyramid was in very bad shape. The sort of inner shaft was having blocks collapse in on it all the time, and it was completely unsafe for people to enter. And so he came in and he did, they did a fantastic job repairing Djoser's pyramid. And then he also went to Djoser, and they're like, well, check up on our other pyramids too, make sure those ones are doing okay. And he did a little bit of repair work at the Red Pyramid, but he came to the Bent Pyramid and he was like, nothing wrong with this pyramid. This pyramid is in great shape. It doesn't need any repair work, which again sort of contradicts what Egyptology had said, that it was unstable.
Sure, yeah, not safe.
He's like, oh no, this pyramid doesn't have any subsidence, right? He could not detect any foundation movement at the Bent Pyramid. And again, this is the engineer that's repairing the pyramid, so it's hard to think of a more reliable testimony than his. But he also had a very interesting thing to say, which is that because he could still see the casing stones on the Bent Pyramid and he could see how they'd moved, he could see how they'd cracked. As a material scientist, he understood that the limestone expands and contracts as it's heated up and cooled, just a very, very small amount. But the cumulative effect of that on a whole pyramid is that if there's not enough, when the limestone expands, inevitably things get a little bit damaged. And so as it cools and contracts, the stones don't go 100% back to their original state. They're always changed a little bit. And so they very, very, very slowly start to move or crack based upon this thermal expansion that happens every day and night, where the blocks heat up in the day and they cool off at night. You can kind of imagine like breathing, sort of. And so very, very slowly, the blocks are being pushed off the pyramid because of this thermal expansion. And in looking at the pattern of blocks as they had fallen off the Bent Pyramid, he was like, yes, this is definitely why pyramids lost their casing stones, or at least some of them did. And so and that was that. He wrote a great book about it called Saving the Pyramids, And Egyptology didn't really do anything with his conclusions. They were like, "Oh, that's neat, okay," they never really followed up on his conclusions. And so when I started studying the bent pyramid, when I went to Egypt, I took a bunch of high-res photographs of it because I wanted to trace the casing stones and study them up close and see if there was any kind of patterns or any kind of information that I could glean from actually looking at the stones as they existed on the pyramid. And you could quickly see that the casing stones have a ton of patches in them. Like the stone, like here you can see there's big blocks and then there's lots of little squares and rectangles cut into the casing stones where they were patched up. And this is really interesting. And it was another reason why Egyptologists had said that the pyramid must have been unstable or they were having problems building it because it's so patched up, right? And it's a natural idea. They're like, okay, well, clearly something wasn't going right here if we're patching the pyramid this much.
Where are the patches? They're the little rectangles.
The little rectangles. Some of them are trapezoids.
And those are like placed on the outside?
Correct. So they're fairly shallow. They're much if you can imagine each stone goes, 6 feet or more into the pyramid. The patches are usually not. They're usually a foot or less deep, right? So they're just like the skin of the casing stones. You can sort of imagine that. Some of them go a bit deeper. I mean, there's a lot of patches on the pyramid, but we can't see the depth of the patches for the most part because you can't look behind it. That's the patches colored in purple, right?
Sure.
So that's a lot of patching.
Yeah, it
right?
is.
You can see why the pyramid got a bad rap, but in looking, in studying all of the patches, and it's crazy. It seems like a crazy idea to do, but I have looked at pretty much all of these things and mapped them out. The patches are not homogeneous on the face of the pyramid. They cluster in specific sections, particularly in the center and in the middle of the pyramid. So sort of in the center of the lower half. And this is where the pyramid is bulging, right? Even back into the 1800s, explorers were like, the faces of this pyramid are kind of convex. It's not a perfect flat plane. And for a long time, people were like, well, why is that? Did they build it that way? Is that part of the construction process? Did they intentionally do that? But in taking Peter James's research, to me, it's clear that the bulging is from the thermal expansion, right? It's the process of those casing stones getting slowly pushed off the pyramid. The stones are particularly vulnerable at the corners because there's two directions they can be pushed, and those stones fall off much quicker, much easier. But the ones in the middle, they've got nowhere to go, and so they get pushed out away from the pyramid a little bit, but they also just crack and fracture too. And so all of the patching, or almost all of it, is where the pyramid is bulging the most, right? And so they're repairing the pyramid as it was being damaged by the thermal expansion. This was not something that happened while the pyramid was being constructed, because the thermal expansion is a very slow, gradual process.
Sure.
It's probably impossible to know exactly what the timetable would be for it, but it's not something that's going to happen in a few years as construction's going up, as the casing stones are being installed. We're talking decades, centuries, maybe longer than that.
Maybe 38,000 years.
I don't know about that.
Okay.
I'm not a materials scientist, so
Yeah.
And so
it would be cool to be able to actually do that math, somehow. Maybe AI can help us with that in the future.
So what's amazing about that, though, is that it demonstrates that the ancient Egyptians were repairing this pyramid for a very long time after it was built.
Right.
And that was not I would never have assumed or guessed that when I first started on this project, because you see how they don't do that for every pyramid, right? If you look at Menkare's pyramid, it still doesn't even have the granite casing stones fully smooth, right? They're still rough. And so the general assumption based upon that, and other evidence too, is that once a pharaoh died in his pyramid complex, like the heavy work just kind of stopped, and the next pharaoh was the belle of the ball, and all the construction resources went to his projects. But I think based upon the patching of the bent pyramid, we can say that was not the case there. That there was still a lot of reverence and attention and resources being put towards that pyramid long after Snefru had passed.
Now, if we can give the builders of the pyramid the benefit of the doubt and say that they would have understood thermal expansion, um, because it's like, gosh, that seems like an obvious one. I just like, I just wonder. So for me, one of the possibilities for the dates of the pyramid is after the Sahara dried up, and it was a lush rainforest, and there was tons of rainfall 5,000 years ago. And then you get this massive decline in the male population in Asia, Africa, and Europe, all at the same time, right when Northern Africa was turning into a desert. And it kind of, this hit me when I was talking to Michael Button as a possibility that maybe this climate change was kind of like what happened with Mongolia when climate change forced them to attack China, and the entire country attacked China and invaded, and Genghis Khan, was evil ruler, and his DNA is everywhere now. And, potentially people living in a rainforest that had to leave the rainforest, moving to other places, killing the male population in all of these places, could account for why that happened, could account for the building of some of the structures. And so I guess for me, it's like if it was if it was built more during a time when the climate was different and there was rainfall, it wasn't as hot, there wasn't as much thermal expansion, it wasn't a desert. Could it have existed in a natural state of moderate expansion and decline from thermal heat, as opposed to this extreme stuff that's causing it to deteriorate?
I don't know that I could. I don't have enough understanding of the materials science to know like what the threshold is in terms of how hot and how cool, what the temperature variation needs to be to start to have an effect on the casing stones. I will say that
I do agree the Egyptians were repairing it for thousands of years, but I'm open to it being built by the Egyptians in the time that the mainstream says that. I'm open to that. I think for me it's a much lower percentage, obviously, but I feel like there's that possibility or probability. There's the potential that it was built during that climate change transition period, and then there's potential that it's like a younger Dryas, and then you talk to Matt, you talk to Matt LaCroix, who I had on this week, and it's, he's confident it's 38,000 years old. He knows that because of the alignments to the stars and to the sun, and when the Sphinx is pointing at directly due east at Leo, and it was a lion, and it certainly wasn't when Khufu and Khafre were there. So. I just that has always I think that sparks the interest of people globally, worldwide, and I just try to stay open to all the possibilities.
Well, I guess if you want to talk a little bit about sort of the cultural effect of the pyramids, I can speak to maybe some original ideas about that, which is that as much as I think that Egyptology and archaeology have it mostly right about the timeline and the reasons and the sort of the factors involved. I think there is room for some nuance, which maybe can make it a little more intuitively tied to the ancient Egyptians. I guess sort of like the simplistic explanation that I don't like is that, the Egyptians at that time were just extremely pious and spiritual, and they worshipped their king as a god, and so they had to build these huge pyramids to sort of like satisfy that sort of like religious fanaticism, for lack of a better term. I think that the pharaohs building the pyramids, I think they got most of the. I think they saw it as they got the most benefit while they were alive, rather than for the afterlife. One sort of framework that I use to understand that idea is that a lot of the pyramids, particularly after the 4th dynasty and the 5th and the 6th dynasties, the pyramids, they're all finished and dressed in the nice limestone. They're not as big, but they're elaborately completed. But the inside of the pyramids are not quite so nice, right? There's just a lot of work that is very sort of rough by comparison, unfinished. You get, pavement that's not installed. You get hieroglyphs aren't painted in.
And it couldn't be that the pavement was taken out later, right? It's.
I mean, I don't think the pavement isn't really particularly valuable after it's installed. I think it's mostly just it gets ripped up when people are like.
I would take a piece of pavement from the King's Chamber. How much would you pay right now for a piece of pavement from the King's Chamber? Come on, man, that's got some value.
I mean, it's cool in the pyramid, right? But outside of the pyramid, it's just a piece of stone, right?
Priceless.
How do you tell the difference between a pavement stone that's from the Great Pyramid and a granite countertop? Afterwards, right? It's just going to be your word, right? It's like I swear this my kitchen countertop was the floor of the King's Chamber.
You got to get pictures. You got to have good provenance. Yes,
but even the sarcophagi are sometimes rough and unsquared, and a lot of these kings lived to be a long time. Like they had plenty of time to finish these sort of minor details, but they didn't bother to do so. What was important to them was getting the pyramid up quickly and sort of using that as a symbol of their ability to sort of marshal resources and command as a monarch. The biggest, most profound change in the funerary landscape with pyramids is the Snefru to Khufu transition, going from the Meidum Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, and the Red Pyramid of Snefru to Giza and the Khufu pyramids. Because prior to Giza, the pyramids, the space around them is really just reserved for the king. You don't have burials like right next to the pyramids, right? It's like you've got the pyramids and the temples, and that's space for the king. And yes, there's a necropolis nearby. Maybe it's like a kilometer away for the people that support and are under the king, but they're not part of the pyramid party, right? They're off to the side. And at the Great Pyramid, it's the reverse, right? Suddenly, the necropolis is right there, as close as possible to the pyramid. And I think that Khufu sort of changed the social contract in the sense that he was like, again, I had mentioned, I think it's the first, it could be the first pyramid that a king really planned on being buried for eternity inside. And he was, and it was sort of a deal where, how do you marshal all of the country to build something like the Great Pyramid? You can't just be because you're cracking a whip. Like that's not going to get a project like that done. You have to get everyone to buy into your vision. And I think he did that by saying, look, we'll make this great funerary monument for me, but you'll also get to be a part of that. My inner family and the elites and the people who have to administrate this vast apparatus to build it. You'll get the benefit of the pyramid because your tomb is going to be essentially right next to mine. And you're going to get that same sort of divine eternal protection because people are always going to be coming here, worshiping at this thing. This thing's never going to be like so many other kings had, once their time's gone, their pyramid or their large mastaba and the cult around it, fades and it gets despoiled because people are on to the next thing. He's like, we're going to create a new model where we will all share in the benefit of building the biggest, most amazing structure of the ancient world, and that's why the necropolis looks like it does at Giza. I mean, you don't see Khafre's pyramid's pretty impressive too, and Menkare's is no slouch, but the mastabas aren't built around those pyramids. They're only around, I won't say only, but the vast, vast majority of them, everyone's choosing to be built next to the Great Pyramid.
Sure.
If your model is, once the pyramids are closed up, there's not, looking, if you don't know what's going inside the pyramids and you're just looking at Khafre and Khufu's pyramids, you wouldn't really, as if you didn't know anything about them, you wouldn't think there was much different about them. In fact, a lot of people today still mistake Khafre's pyramid for the Great Pyramid,
right,
because it's a little steeper of an angle. It looks a little bit better from certain vantage points. But nobody, not in ancient Egypt, not in the Greek times, not in the Roman times, nobody forgot which pyramid was the Great Pyramid, right? That one always stood out. And I think, again, that speaks to the fact that people were able to go inside and see how magnificent it was. And that was really how Khufu that was really sort of the model that he approached to getting it built and to ensuring that his glory would last forever.
Welcome back, man.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah,
Good to be back.
Yeah, for sure. So, any thoughts on Vases, I guess, before we get into the next pyramid?
It was really fun seeing him up close. I don't really study artifacts very much, and so it's still a bit foreign to me. But it is always amazing to see something that's that old and was clearly very important to people that lived so long ago, right in front of you. Like, you just never get to have that experience in the modern day.
Yeah.
And so that was really special. I enjoyed it.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Grateful to be able to share it with you. Grateful that you made it the trip across the country again
Yes.
to come over here. So pumped, man, as I reiterated again at lunch, pumped that this is your first major podcast.
Yes.
Very grateful for that. And I think we just continue, this is really going to be the pyramid, the pyramids according to history for Granite.
The pyramid special. We can talk, there's another of Snefru's pyramids that I wanted to talk a little bit about, which was his first one at Meidum. Everyone can recognize this pyramid in the sense that it doesn't look like a pyramid anymore because the outer mantle is completely gone and it looks kind of like a stepped tower. And Meidum, kind of like the bent pyramid, has gotten a bad rap because if Snefru continued to build pyramids after this pyramid, the sort of conventional wisdom is that it must have been defective or inadequate, or something must have not been up to snuff. And I don't have too much to say, I think, about the pyramid itself. The one thing that I do like to point out is that this is the only pyramid that's actually the only Old Kingdom pyramid that's sort of comfortable to walk into. The passage is a bit taller than the other passages. You don't actually have to sort of hunch over.
So you're saying the tall whites did this one?
What I'm saying is that everyone thinks that the only reason that the pyramid passages are typically.
I want to be clear for the audience. That's an alien joke, not a racist joke.
I got that it was a joke. I just didn't know how to pivot off of it.
Yeah.
The tall three-fingered aliens did it.
Right. Yeah.
So everyone always assumes that one of the reasons the pyramid passages leading into them are so small is so that because they weren't really designed to be moved in and out of, and so they could be plugged more easily. But this being the first real Fourth Dynasty large pyramid, clearly that wasn't the case at this pyramid, right? Because it's very human-sized. It's designed to be walked in and out of. It would be much harder to plug a shape of this size. And so I think when you take this as a starting point for pyramids, you can see that, they were, even though to us it seems like really weird that the entrance passages are so small in many of them. I think that's more of a security measure in terms of the portcullises being defendable and not so easily attacked. And I also think that it would have been a lot easier to get in and out of pyramids in their original state, because you could just slide down on your butt or put a little like rug or whatever and just slide down. Whereas this one, you were clearly walking. You're clearly walking upright up and down it.
What's the angle on that entrance?
Descending passages in the 20-some degrees, 25 degrees. I never have these measurements off the top of my head, but somewhere in there.
So no problem to walk. I mean,
yeah.
Because we got rails and we got steps but
now
none
we have
of that
rails
was
and steps.
there.
The rails and steps actually make it harder, especially in the other pyramids, to get in.
Really?
Right? Because you can't slot. You have to sort of it's easier to walk backwards, but the steps kind of inhibit you getting in. Now, getting out, they're helpful. But they actually make it harder to get in.
Okay. All right.
In a weird kind of way.
So keep walking us through this.
All right.
Then.
So at Meidum, Snefru's first big pyramid that gets kind of a bad rap. What's really interesting to me is that, his highest officials are buried at this cemetery. They're not found at his later necropolis where the bent pyramid and the red pyramid are. Like his presumably his eldest son Nefermat is buried in a huge mastaba called Mastaba 16 nearby. He was the vizier, which is basically the highest title you can have in Egypt. You can see in the reliefs that were preserved, in their mastaba that he had like 15 or 16 kids or something like that. He lived a long time.
Okay.
And there's another mastaba nearby.
I mean, you could do that in a few days if you really wanted to, but
Do what in a few days?
Well, 16 kids can either take a short period of time or a long period of time.
I guess in ancient Egypt, I imagine. I don't know. I guess I don't really know how quickly that could happen in ancient Egypt. I'm assuming. I'm assuming it's a sign that he was pretty long lived.
Yeah, you see the cat. You see the cat problem in ancient Egypt.
He does. He is buried with his wife, Atet, in a twin mastaba. So presumably he was a monogamous type of guy.
Oh, okay. All from his wife. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that's impressive.
Yeah. The kids are named in his wife's tomb, not his. So that's so presumably this is presumably
it was nice of the mistresses to donate the children back to the family. So good. That's a lot on one woman. You got to.
Yeah, it is. That's what I'm saying. That's why I think he probably lived to a ripe old age. Snefru's first son, of course. Another son of Snefru was, of course, Khufu, builder of the Great Pyramid. Right. So these are the highest of the highest elites at this time in ancient Egypt. But there's another mysterious mastaba built next to Meidum called Mastaba 17 because its owner, it's not inscribed with anything, so its owner is just anonymous. And this is, I told you before how the people buried near around Snefru's pyramids are not buried right next to the pyramid. They're sort of, off into their own distinct space. The only exception is this Mastaba 17 next to the Meidum Pyramid. And not only is this the only mastaba in Snefru's era, this only royal mastaba that's right up next to the pyramid, but it's also sort of like the grandest, most exquisite mastaba ever. It's got the biggest, oldest granite sarcophagus. It's not the biggest, but it's the oldest granite sarcophagus known in ancient Egypt. Is built inside this thing. It's bigger than the one in the Great Pyramid. It's better made too. And, Egyptology sort of doesn't know what to do with this mastaba. They're like, well, there must have been, because they say that the pharaoh had to go into the pyramid, every pharaoh. If a pharaoh was building pyramids, he's going in the pyramid. And so they're like, well, this must have been some like really extremely wealthy prince for which we don't have any evidence of what his name or title could have been. Because remember, as number one guy, there's no position that we know of in ancient Egypt that's higher than a vizier. Is Nefermat with his 15, who had 15 kids over in Mastaba 16. And so they haven't really made headway on solving this thing. But in my opinion, I think there's the sarcophagus in Mastaba 17. Mastaba 17 also has blocks in it that are in like the ceiling that are larger than blocks in any of Snefru's pyramids. You've got bigger blocks than the biggest, fanciest blocks inside the Red Pyramid, inside Mastaba 17. It's hard to imagine anyone in ancient Egypt being able to do that other than a pharaoh, right? And so my interpretation is that actually this is where Snefru ended up. That maybe he was considering, maybe the Bent Pyramid was considered an option to be buried in, but that ultimately he ended up in Mastaba 17. But what's crazy about...
Is that a common theory?
No.
Okay.
I mean, it's something that I think people have considered, but I don't think... I haven't read anyone else that's actually favored that opinion.
Okay.
It's not considered... It's certainly not considered a crazy opinion, but it's just like Egyptology really likes to put the pharaoh in the pyramid.
Sure. Yeah. And it's one of those things that you can't... you can't conclusively prove. So why would they make that their right? I mean,
right. It's tough.
You can't prove or disprove.
You can't prove or disprove it. Unfortunately, the skeleton was still mostly intact inside that granite sarcophagus, and it was removed, and the bones were lost in World War II. Which is, I think it's kind of crazy to think that Egyptology might have actually had the mummy of an old kingdom pharaoh, but now it's gone.
How did it get lost and destroyed?
They shipped it to Britain, and I believe it was Britain. And in World War II, there was the bombings, and it was in a building that was destroyed. And
wow.
There's still pictures of it, so you can still see pictures of the skull. There was also a wooden crook found, piece of a wooden crook with the skeleton, and that's a classic symbol of Egyptian royalty. It doesn't necessarily 100% mean it had to be a king, but it's a pretty good clue.
I'm getting cremated, man. Forget all this digging up all these dead bodies. Right? Yeah.
So we'll tie this into Nefermat here in a second.
All right.
But the sad thing about Mastaba 17 is before then it had been plundered, and it had been plundered in such a way because Mastaba 17 was also unique in that it was never built with an entrance, meaning the person who was buried there had died before the structure was complete. The individual died, they put him in Mastaba 17, and just, there was no passage leading to the burial chambers. But the tunnel that's dug into it, like, directly makes head on for like the shortest position, the easiest, fastest way to get inside. And so clearly whoever was digging knew exactly where to dig, right? And again, remember, even if you don't think this is Snefru, this is still like one of the most rich and powerful people in ancient Egypt. And a similar thing happens to Nefermat, his vizier with the 15 or 16 kids, except that Nefermat doesn't even make it a day in his tomb. When Wainwright and Petrie first excavate that mastaba, they tunnel into the chamber. They find the chamber completely sealed. It's still, there's a picture, you can see the entrance is still all bricked up, and there's no other tunnel leading inside. So this is supposed to be an unspoiled tomb because there's no way out that anyone could have gotten in. But sure enough, they find that Nefermat is not in his wooden sarcophagus. His mummy is like hitched up against the wall, kind of, and been stripped of anything that might have been valuable on it. So Nefermat, this is Khufu's half brother, doesn't even make it a day inside his tomb, right? And so, this is some suspicious activity here that's going on. You expect always that, tomb robbing is going to be a problem, but why are the richest, most powerful people at this specific time, at this specific place, having this happen to them? And there's just a few royal mastabas there next to the Meidum Pyramid, but then there's a different cemetery to the west of it, and there's about 35 or so sort of more traditional, sort of middle class, for lack of a better term, mastabas. And in 35 of these, only 3 of them were used originally. Sometimes later people come in and stick their mummies inside, but only 3 could potentially have been used. And so this is a big deal because building your tomb in ancient Egypt, like, that was a pretty serious expense. You'd probably plan for it your whole life. Mm-hmm. So to have everyone at the same time abandon Meidum as a place to be buried showed that there was a strong incentive at some point to not end up there. And I think that ties into what I was talking about earlier with the Great Pyramid changing the social contract, and how do you persuade everyone to build you the biggest pyramid of all time? And that's that it's like a pyramid scheme, right? You're buying in to that new vision of the world, and that everyone who didn't buy in, they were either pillaged randomly, or more likely Khufu was like, yeah, go ahead, maybe it sends a message if his dad or his brother isn't safe at Meidum, because that way everyone's like fully committed now. It's like, okay, if I'm going to make it to the afterlife, like, I got to build this pyramid for Khufu so that I can be next to Khufu, and so that that's not going to happen to me.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So, yeah. Anything else on that one?
One last thing I will say is that there are a few other interesting burial sites near the pyramid, which Petrie excavated again at the same time, early 20th century. And these, unlike other Egyptian tombs, were designed to be completely hidden. Petrie called them the great tombs because they were pretty big and fancy for their time. And so they also were unused, like so many other of the mastabas nearby. But there was no superstructure. There was nothing designed to be built on top of them, right? This has not happened before in ancient Egypt. It was such that you could bury someone in, and you would cover it with the desert, and nobody would ever know that there was a burial there. And apparently these tombs were unused as well. And it clearly shows that, that some people had this in mind of, like, how do you actually secure your tomb for eternity? What's the best strategy? And, the elites definitely, sort of played by their own rules. And I find it very conspicuous that Khufu's mother, Hetepheres, she was all at Giza. She was also buried in an unmarked tomb. I don't know if it's the only one, but certainly it was one of the only ones. It was the deepest, most hidden shaft at the Giza necropolis, which is why it wasn't discovered until the 20th century. And so clearly, and so when people say, oh, well, maybe the Great Pyramid wasn't supposed to be a tomb, there is circumstantial evidence regarding what the elites in society are doing at that time, which could lend credits to the fact that, well, yeah, maybe he really didn't think that he would ultimately have been safe in the pyramid forever because of what was happening at Meidum and his closest relatives.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe coming off of the lunch break, taking a look at the vases. Of course, a huge number of vases were taken from the step pyramid.
Yes.
Yeah. So you get 40,000 or so, most which alabaster, but then you got about almost 900 hard stone vases, and I guess we talked a little bit at lunch about your thoughts on Djoser and
Djoser, yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the step pyramid is very unique. So it's very hard. I always say that my best way of studying the pyramids is compare them to each other. And there's not really anything you can really compare the step pyramid to, which makes it particularly difficult. Also, it's kind of isolated in time because it's a few kings before you start really getting the pyramids, the Fourth Dynasty pyramids that everyone's familiar with. But what's most interesting to me about the step pyramid, or one of the things that's really interesting, is that it doesn't start out as a pyramid, and it doesn't start out as a mastaba either. A lot of people think that, oh yeah, the Egyptians, they buried themselves under mastabas, which is like a horizontal elevated structure. And the idea for the Djoser's pyramid was that they just started stacking these mastabas on top of each other, and then you have the evolution into the pyramid form. And Egyptologists know, the ones that specialize in this type of architectural study, know that that's not what happened. The very first inner structure of the step pyramid is like a mastaba, and then it's a raised structure, but it's square. It's not rectangular. And there's a lot of mastabas in Egypt, ancient Egypt, and none of them are square, right? So whatever it was that they were starting, whatever their starting idea was for the step pyramid, it was not a traditional funerary structure. It was not a mastaba such that a person would be buried under. It was something else. And then eventually, it goes through two iterations like that. So there's M1, which is the first squared structure, and then it's built, it's expanded. That's sort of the second phase. And then in the third phase, it is elongated to turn into that mastaba shape, that classic rectangle that we know the ancient Egyptians loved to be buried under. And it's at that stage when it's elongated that it covers some of the deepest burial shafts at the step pyramid structure. And that is where they're finding a lot of those stone vases and, some alabaster sarcophagi and sort of the funerary stuff that, there we go. We've got a diagram of the various stages there. Yeah, you can see there M3 on the right with those deep shafts deep below it. So that it's only at M3 that it's sort of the structure's being transformed into something that looks more recognizable as an Egyptian funerary monument. And so I find that kind of conspicuous in the sense that pyramids in of themselves were not necessarily originally conceived as the place for the body, right? This is an idea that had to develop and evolve over time. And that's why you see, I think this sort of transition is another representation of that, where it doesn't start necessarily as a place that people are going to be interred within, but then it becomes one.
So, yeah, okay.
And that's also could be, the other aspect to that is, it's hotly debated whether or not these really deep burial shafts under M3 there were created by Djoser, and that he just took all of this pottery, or it's not pottery, the stone vases and the stoneware into it. He had taken it from, because a lot of these stone vessels are older than Djoser. They're early dynastic or even pre-dynastic. Right. And so it's like, why does he have all this old stuff, right? Did he just go about taking it, across the countryside and putting it in? Or could it have already been there, and then when Djoser incorporates that into his sort of proto-pyramid, that's sort of the phase in which the idea evolves. Like, oh no, we'll actually turn this into something that is more like a burial site than whatever it was being conceived of in its original design.
Okay.
Everyone, Egyptology loves to say that big granite box down there at the bottom is a sarcophagus, but there's no sarcophagus in the world that looks like that thing. I think like another thought exercise is if, say, Djoser was the last Egyptian pharaoh and Egyptian civilization for whatever reason ended after Djoser, I don't think Egyptologists would say that granite structure is a sarcophagus or is where a likely place where Djoser would have been buried, right? That they're projecting later pyramids in which it becomes a more traditional funerary structure. They're projecting that idea back in time towards the step pyramid, which I think is a poor way of looking at it. I think it's something that people had to get used to, right? I mean, imagine you're a king and your priest is like, and everyone you've ever known who, was, resurrected or has an afterlife was buried under a mastaba. And then it's like, well, you know what? We're going to do something different. We're going to build a pyramid, and we're going to put you in that. And that's how you're going to do the afterlife. But it's never been done before.
You'll be fine.
Right. Yeah. You wouldn't just immediately jump at that.
Yeah.
You wouldn't be like, that's right. Let's do it. You might be like, well,
what could possibly go wrong?
Maybe, right? They had to get comfortable with the idea of the pyramid becoming like the place that you could be buried within or inside. And I don't think that's something that happened immediately the way Egyptology tends to align with.
Okay. So that's really kind of one of your major diversions from Egyptology.
Yeah, I don't think I'm contradicting like any like core tenets of Egyptology by saying this. I just think that they haven't. I think that their model of the earliest pyramids is less robust by just assuming that it was just as simple as, okay, first we had mastabas, now we have pyramids, and it's just a substitute. It's basically the same thing.
Okay. And then what about the biggest mysteries or biggest unknowns within this pyramid? Is there anything here that jumps out at you?
Djoser's pyramid?
Yeah.
What's fascinating about Djoser's pyramid is just that how special it was for the Egyptians, for thousands of years even. They always recognized as this sort of as being the place where things really, their society really, came together. You see even Middle Kingdom pharaohs, have like their sarcophagi made in such a way that is callback to the design of the Djoser necropolis. And so it was clearly very special to them in a way that no other site was. And so, you could say that tradition started with Djoser, or you could say, in the idea of, the sort of pre-dynastic and early dynastic pottery, that tradition maybe could have predated Djoser by quite some time. And that Djoser he built the first pyramid there, sort of integrating himself into a much older tradition at Saqqara that, I don't think that we can really fully understand. And I think that's really where you get the strong ties to the older history of Egypt. I mean, it's all old, but the really old stuff.
Okay. So let's move on.
Okay.
Yep. And then, so in terms of next, I mean, I'm going to let you choose it, and let's make it the biggest banger of a topic that we can talk about that's going to get people the most interested.
Oh no. Here I am at the spot.
Yep.
Well, I mean, maybe we should talk about the big void, because everyone loves the big void.
Yeah.
Hopefully we're going to get to see inside the big void this year. That was the original timeline that we were promised. So I'm still hoping for that.
I'm still pushing for that.
That's why I very much appreciate you, Matt.
Yeah.
What's amazing to me about the big void is that, the sort of the mundane explanation that people give, which is maybe the safest explanation. That's why people with degrees like the safe explanation, is that this is just empty space that they framed in to, protect the structures underneath it, right? It's just to protect the Grand Gallery there. And my problem with that interpretation goes all the way back to the Meidum Pyramid, where the Meidum Pyramid does have little empty spaces above some of its chambers and its lower passages that are a relieving space, right? So we do see this kind of thing in another pyramid that came before, but the design is so different, right? They're small. These spaces at the Meidum Pyramid are small. They're right above the ceiling of the space they're supposed to protect. And so, why at the Great Pyramid is our hypothetical, protective space so far away from the structures that it's supposed to protect, right? Why is it all the way up there? Why is the north face corridor so high if it's just protecting the descending passage? Why isn't it right on top of the passage? And so could it be something else? Could it have to do with how the pyramid was constructed? Was there something mechanical going on in the Grand Gallery to facilitate the movement of blocks up onto the pyramid that is being replicated in this hypothetical? The space isn't hypothetical, but whatever hypothetical Grand Gallery structure that could be above it. That's kind of an intriguing idea. If I'm going to be safe, I will say that maybe at the Great Pyramid, the thing is they knew that these spaces didn't need protection. They'd engineered it as such that they knew the passages and even the top of the Grand Gallery are only 2 cubits or about a meter wide, right? They know this thing's not going to fall down without the protective space above. So then it's like, well, why are they just really, really going the extra mile? And I kind of like the idea that the reason there's the big void, and that the reason that there's the north face corridor, and that the reason that there's the so-called relieving spaces above the king's chamber, is that it's not that they were afraid or concerned that the pyramid wasn't gonna hold up under the weight, but that these are the spaces that they just really wanted to look nice. Right? They didn't want, any pyramid, and especially you see this at Snefru's pyramids, you get a tiny little bit of subsidence and you get huge cracks. It doesn't mean that the room's going to fall apart, but just the blocks break and then it looks ugly, right? It's like this is supposed to be like the pharaoh's like grand jewel of his afterlife, and if you see cracks in it, it's like I don't know, maybe he's not God if his pyramids all cracked up. And so I guess the sort of I think in terms of my understanding, I think the most likely explanation is that these are just the places that were supposed to look really nice inside the pyramid, because they were also the most visible, right? Everyone's going to stop and look up at the Grand Gallery. Everyone's looking at the ceiling of the king's chamber because it's so big and magnificent. And as you're entering the pyramid at the entrance, you're going to notice any sort of cracking or damage there around the entrance as well. And so I think if I'm aligning those 3 sort of potentially relieving type structures inside the pyramid, that's sort of the only common thread I can bring through all 3.
Okay. Yeah, I get that, and makes some sense. But help me with the pyramid was sealed, right? So you couldn't get in. Oh, the people that would have been in there looking around and stuff. What am I missing?
So here's the fun thing about sealing the pyramid, right? Egyptologists like to think that maybe these pyramids were all plugged up with stones, right? That have just been lost to time, that people have since totally destroyed them and ripped them all out. But I think the physical evidence contradicts that. I think really in terms of the Great Pyramid, you only have a few protective measures. You have the sarcophagus, which locks with pin locks. You have the portcullis, which, in my opinion, is designed to be openable. And then you have the 3 granite plugs slid into the ascending passage. But the question is, like, why, if you're going to plug a pyramid, why plug it from the inside, right? What benefit does that confer upon you? It'd be much more secure and technically simple to plug it from the outside than the inside. So why do it from the inside, right? That seems to make no... In fact, Egyptologists think that the well shaft was how the workers who pushed those plugs down would escape, right? Because they'd have to do it from behind, and then they'd be sealed inside, so they needed a way out. So there seems to be quite a few drawbacks And if it doesn't work right, then you're really in trouble. So there seems to be quite a few drawbacks to plugging a pyramid from inside, except the fact that you can close the pyramid sort of permanently at any time. You can wait, you can have those plugs stored in the Grand Gallery, and it could be Egyptians decades or centuries later that are finally deciding, okay, you know what, that we're not gonna engage in our cultural activities inside this pyramid anymore, and we're gonna try and shut it permanently. And so I think that's the only good reason to have the plugs where they are. And the oldest accounts of the Great Pyramid said that there was a door at the entrance, a movable stone, and you see a socket for a hinge at the entrance to the bent pyramid. So it clearly had something like a door at one point in time. And so the model of the pyramids being like this stone fortress that was really just designed to keep people out, I think does not align with the physical evidence.
All right, good, man. So, this has been an amazing conversation. I mean, I guess in terms of final, kind of closing.
Final thoughts?
Well, thoughts, or was there one more topic before final thoughts or anything?
I'm afraid if I start another topic, I'm gonna be talking
Fair.
for 2 hours straight.
Yeah.
I am going back to Egypt this year on tour in October with Adept Expeditions as run by NEXT, and this is going to be a very special tour in that we're really only doing pyramids plus the Grand Egyptian Museum. We're going to be going into, it's pretty much entirely special permissions. So we're going to a bunch of places. We're going to see a bunch of pyramids inside that no tour group's ever gone into before. And so I'm really excited about that. And I sort of always see these opportunities to do something very special like that as sort of, I always try to tie that into my work where it's like, this is going to be a real opportunity to take photos and see evidence that hasn't been able to be scrutinized as closely ever before. And so it's part of it's like a tour and part of it's like a research project for me. And I think that's going to be a really special thing.
Yeah, that's exciting for sure. Yeah, and it's a big trip. Yeah, you were telling me about some of the sites last night that you guys got access to, and that's pretty cool. And I mean, there's some sites there where if people got pictures of it, and we're able to make videos of that. I think that you got a ton of just viral content that people haven't seen before that people were going to be super interested in. So it sounds like it's going to be a great trip for you.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it. The first time I went to Egypt, was a huge success in terms of that I had a ton of photos and documentation that allowed me to, make these discoveries and investigations that I've been doing for the past 2 years that I've been featuring on my channel. And so I'm hoping that this will be, a whole nother round of mysteries to investigate and hopefully conclusions to reach.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, you just put out a video 4 or 5 days ago, and what are you working on coming up? What are you researching right now? What are you most interested in?
On the trip, one thing that I really look forward to investigating are the portcullises in those later pyramids, because, at Khufu's pyramid, I think it's pretty clear, how they operated it in terms of they had rope holes and they'd sort of pull him up with that kind of manpower. But the later pyramids, the portcullises just sort of come down and there's no apparatus. There's no sort of rope or pulley mechanism that you could have lifted them up with. So they had to be levered up. They had to take some wedges, hammer them probably under to get the first little bit of lift, and then had prying bars to lift the portcullis up. And, just like a tomb robber would. But I think these portcullises were designed so that they would be very difficult to lift, but that the priesthood that had the right tools and had the right knowledge would be able to do it, on the occasions that it called for. And so I'm really, really interested to take a look at some of these other portcullises in these other pyramids that have not been photographed very well or documented very well, because Egyptology is really not very interested in portcullises. They kind of just see them as a boring obstruction that they don't think that there's anything more to it than that. But I think these were really stones that were designed to be secure but movable.
Gotcha. Are there any mysteries? Like, I know I've asked this question about several of the individual pyramids, but are there any mysteries out there, potentially, from the alternative standpoint of history? And I know you're not just going by the mainstream. You vary from that in many ways, and so I guess I'm just curious. Like, is there anything that you think is I mean, the Great Pyramid being built in 25 years, there's some, I think, legitimate questions about that. The Younger Dryas catastrophe, the Serapeum boxes, the just the construction, how they moved the blocks across deserts, how they were moving 1,000-ton statues, 500 miles. Nobody knows how they drag that with sleds. Like, does any of this kind of like?
Well, here's what I'll say about that, which is that I think even though that most of my sort of understanding of ancient Egypt maybe isn't in that sphere, I still think that every investigation is valuable, right? Everyone, if they're really passionate about it and they really do put in the work and look into things, has something to contribute, no matter what their beliefs or conclusions may be. I always think back to a pyramidologist named Morton Edgar, who was investigating the Great Pyramid at the beginning of the 20th century. And Morton Edgar was a very pious guy. He was part of the Watchtower Society, which was sort of like the precursor to the Jehovah's Witnesses. And he firmly believed that the Great Pyramid, the sort of measurements inside it were, sort of encoded in the Bible, and sort of would explain like the entire history of mankind, basically, was in the measurements of the Great Pyramid. And I don't think there's probably hardly anyone today that would agree with his conclusions, but his investigations were meticulous. They were insightful. He took a lot of pictures that are only photographs inside the Great Pyramid that are that old. And he was actually the first person to discover that the Queen's Chamber air channels went all the way up, almost to the edge of the pyramid. Egyptology just assumed that they basically were cut short right after you could right out of sight, because they thought they were just dummy spiritual sort of architecture. And Edgar proved that that was not true. And in fact, Edgar even told the head Egyptologist at Giza at that time, George Reisner, about what he had found. And George Reisner got extremely angry and he had him thrown out of his office. Yep. And that was it. And then nobody knew what these metal rods were doing inside the air channels when the robots first crawled up them in 1993, right? It was like, what is going on here, right? And that was Morton Edgar. He was the first one who proved what the air channels, at least physically, were like. And so I always think that I always try to encourage people, no matter what their angle is of investigation, that it is worth doing. You never know what you're going to find if you look, right? And so we should always be encouraging people to look. And I just think so. In that sense, I think there's room for everyone.
Yeah, agreed, and really well said. Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, people like that. It's a great example, of course, because right in Egypt and contributing to Egyptian history. But there's people like that in every field, all across the world, that are the alternative people that have made contributions throughout history to countless fields. Armchair couch scientists. That are. I mean, the Younger Dryas. There's been throughout history. I mean, Einstein was probably looked at as a crazy person. He was looked at as a crazy person early on, of course, but then eventually the mainstream claims Einstein, right? And so ultimately those ideas get incorporated into the mainstream, but there still have to be people that are thinking differently and people that are adding to the conversation from a different, perspective and approach and whatnot. So
absolutely,
it's critical.
I always say that every good idea starts out as a bad idea, right? That's you never get it right, your first whack, and so people shouldn't be criticized just because their ideas are bad, right? They should be encouraged to just keep developing them until they're good ideas. And I do think it's admirable that people do try to work things out in their own way. I think that's, not many people have the curiosity and drive to really do investigate the world around them, on their own terms. A lot of people are just content to just believe what they're told. And so, I think the more people that are doing that kind of thing, the better.
Yeah, well said, well said. Well, good, man. We'll wrap it up with that. Again, History for Granite on YouTube. That's the best place to follow you. Every one of your videos that when I check, it's 750, 1 million views. It's crazy the popularity, the following, and it's just great content. You're just putting out amazing content. It is very logical. It's very pragmatic, and I think that people enjoy the approach that you take to the videos and to the research that you do for your videos. It's well done. So your perspective on this show is very much appreciated. And, I, again, appreciate you coming down, and we'll do it again. If you ever get any, kind of breaking updates or news or whatever, and you want to come out somewhere and do it, just know you got a plane ticket.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. It's been a real treat. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. We'll wrap it with that. Thank you, Ryan.